Hello and welcome to this session where we continue to look at this essay which reads the American theatre and places it in the historical context. So we notice that despite the changing circumstances and the changing market conditions, there is a way in which the theatre, the American 20th century American drama, remains as a focal point of American intellectual life, and that has not seen this status continues to exist despite the status that movies have, despite the popularity that movies and other newer forms of entertainment begin to capture. What is being noticed over here is there's a significant change of mood in American history. There's a shifting of fortune after the Second World War. And what we also find is a seismic demographic transformation that began after the war, and it continues for the next 25 years or so, next quarter century. And there are a lot of other things also happening simultaneously. And this becomes important for us to be able to appreciate the context, the extra-literary context which produce these plays. So there is a drastic increase in the population. Between 1945 and 1960, apparently the general population increased by 40.1 million to 180 million, which would be like close to 29%. And there is also a rising middle class, and with this large middle class, the segment of the middle class which had lived in New York and other urban centers. And we find that there is their presence, their growing presence, it fuels an urban mercantilism in this process. And we find that by 1960, there is a very visible transformation from the earlier decades. What we notice over here is about 900,000 white population, 900,000 whites, they move out of New York. And by 1960, one of the three Americans lived in a suburb. So this is a different kind of a shift altogether, with people, moving to the suburbs and moving towards the rural economies to perhaps, make more profit and perhaps try out the ways to make a different kind of a fortune. Just the way we find Willy Loman's character in Death of a Salesman lamenting that there was a missed opportunity when his Uncle Bob offered him something out in the suburbs. And this move is very significant, and this transformation is very eloquently expressed in Todd Gitlin's work, The 60s. The Puritan utopia of a city on a hill found its strange completion in the flatland of the American suburb. For growing numbers, daily life was delivered from the cramp of the city, lifted out to the half-white, half-open spaces, where the long-sought and long-feared American wilderness could be trimmed back and made habitable. The prairie became the lawn, the ranch house, the saloon, the formica bar. So this transformation is happening in alignment with the changing economic conditions. So by 1960, it's I noticed that, as per the statistics, 75% of families owned a car, 87% a television, and America very soon becomes the first society in history to have more college graduates than farmers. It certainly is a very, very different kind of a change, which is why Daniel Will also pointed out in End of Ideology that this is a crisis, a dilemma, an anxiety which comes out of prosperity. It's not something that emerges out of poverty, not something that emerges out of any lack. It's out of plenty, out of abundance, and out of prosperity. So we very soon find that there's a different kind of a culture which replaces this urban culture. It's the automobile culture. So earlier in the sociological sense, what was easier to understand was the shift of population from the rural economies to the urban centers. Now here we find that the urban centers, the urban culture is getting replaced by what they begin to refer to as the automobile culture. And this also, paves way to the other structures and institutions which emerge, such as shopping centers, malls. So we find that for those who had left the cities, there were fewer and fewer reasons to return, as it is mentioned over here, because things become more and more accessible irrespective of the location. And there is, in that sense, a more distributed kind of growth, an attempt at least towards a more democratic kind of dissemination of wealth, as was also pointed out by many other historians. But nevertheless, we find that there are other dilemmas to deal with which would emerge, as is pointed out in this following passage. As the white middle class left the cities, they were replaced in large by African Americans moving north from the rural South and Latino groups moving from the Caribbean and Latin America, all hoping to benefit from the perceived prosperity. So here we begin to see a shift in demographics. It's also affecting the sociological background over here. So we find that the African Americans, they also want to have their share of this prosperity, this perceived prosperity, and there is a massive move towards these urban centers, which have been vacated by the white population, because they also move to the rural centers. So and this, in fact, is asking for a different representation, a different articulation in the theatre space as well, in the artistic space as well. So the economic base of the theatre of the previous decades is being lost. The intellectual and cultural face of the city is getting altered. This begs for newer kinds of representation. But what also needs to be noticed is that even in these decades, in the 1940s to the 1960s, there's very little representation from the new population and the potential new audiences within the theatre world. So the last play that we looked at, Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, it is an attempt, though very, perhaps, very subdued, it is an attempt to address this gap, to fill this increasing case. So certain things continue to remain the change, because the production of theatre, it remains in the hands of the older generation, or the same segment of society which is deserting the city for the rural, for the suburbs. It remains in under their control. But it's also it's a difficult market to dig into for the new audiences, for the underrepresented and new emergent population, from the African American population, the Latino groups who are moving from Latin America and Caribbean. So the theatre, it's possible to say that at this point, it has already become very institutionalized. As pointed out at the beginning of this essay, this is emerging, the theatre was soon emerging as an extension of the national consciousness, because there was nothing else to take that place until then. So the theatre had become so institutionalized that rather than attempting to change, it metaphorically dug in its heels. So this is the situation by late 1960s. So as these changes continue to happen, and there's another sort of a challenge that the theatre goers and the theatre producers and the playwrights have to face. It's about being overshadowed by television. So overshadowed by television, the theatre, once prestigious, ubiquitous, and a mirror of national identity, had by the 60s become an elitist entertainment aimed at a narrow segment of the population. So it continues to be an extension of the national consciousness. It continues to mirror the national identity, but it also has carved out a niche kind of audience and a niche kind of space in the artistic world. It has become more elitist, and rather than the mass entertainment culture which is getting produced through televisions and through the newer audiovisual modes like radio, like the newer visual modes like cinema, which is massively taking over the world. So it is, and it needs to be stated over here that there is a very ironical shift over here with theatre, which was seen as a mass entertainment. Now that has become a elitist form of entertainment, and that place, the space occupied by these mass entertainers, that has been taken over entirely by television and movies. So movies had taken over the melodrama, the thesis drama, the well-made play, and the romantic comedy. Television had taken over vaudeville and all forms of popular entertainment, including the domestic comedy that had held the stage since the time of Menander. So they have to subscribe to a niche audience, an elitist audience, in order to make their mark. But the important point is it continues to be seen as a marker of national identity in a literary sense, in the sense of a performance, in the sense of the category of art. And we also need to understand, what happens to the Broadway theatre then. Yeah. So we'll just read through this passage. By the early 50s, most people involved with Broadway theatre began to sound a note of panic as they recognized this situation. The pessimism was plaintively expressed by the critic John Chapman, dispiritedly summing up the season for the best plays of 1950-51. We must not look toward the future with any great amount of confidence, for the American theatre has been in a decline during all the recent years. This decline has been both economic and artistic. Inflation has caused the economic decline, and few people can afford to be regular theatre goers anymore, because theatre is seen as a more expensive form of entertainment, hence elitist, and television, it was invading the living rooms of every American home, and that was meeting all kinds of entertainment needs as well. In A History of Broadway 20 years later, Brooks Atkinson notes that theatre as an industry was obsolete. After the Second World War, theatre owners became acutely conscious of a pitiless fact of life. Theatre could earn an income for only 22 hours a week, making only meager use of the expensive land it occupied. So theatre was, by then, it wasn't an art form. It wasn't seen as a form of art anymore. It was recognized as a business. And it was important to make these decisions based on the kind of economic sense that it made. Yeah. So the theatre then is recognized as a business and as an industry, and it was measured accordingly in terms of the land it occupied and the revenue that it generated. And this is precisely the result of the capitalist conditions that America was beginning to occupy during these decades. And one cannot get judgmental about these decisions, but because that was also a means through which America as a whole ensured that there are alternate pathways towards prosperity. One had to make sense of these financial decisions without it affecting the component of art and entertainment, and vice versa. Yeah. So the 1950s, if you recall all the plays that we have done so far, in the 1950s, it's still a very conservative society. It has still being perceived as a period of conformity and stasis, but though there are minor changes happening in terms of the attitudes, in terms of accommodating and accepting the marginalized population, in terms of accepting the alternate modes of thinking in terms of sexuality, in terms of gender. But though, it is largely seen as a period of conformity, we do think, we do find that there are a lot of newer challenges which these plays and the other forms of art works are able to raise as well. And there is an increasing paranoia also which is developing alongside. We saw this very clearly in Glass Menagerie. We saw this in A Zoo Story. There is a sense of paranoia developing in every individual due to their location or their mislocation. We find that in Lorraine Hansberry's play too, very evidently because of their very visible different kind of identity. Yeah. So this paranoid view of the world, and it is not just limited to the identity politics like we have been seeing in the plays of the 1950s and early 60s. Yeah. So for instance, cartoonist Walt Kelly, and he played upon this perception of the world at the start of the environmental movement and said, we have met the enemy and he is us. Yeah. So there is a growing sense of paranoia, which also becomes a part of the national consciousness in some form, if we may see it so. So the paranoid view of the world was captured in science fiction films and comic books that said, menacing blobs, things, body snatchers, aliens, resurrected prehistoric monsters and mutated creatures. Yeah. So there was also this paranoia that the alternate kinds of politics might completely snatch away the benefits of a capitalist society. Like communists will steal your soul as you let down your guard. Whenever science tries to play God, it leads to tragic results, and such sort of paranoia which took all kinds of forms, not just in the theatrical productions, but in the other TV series, in the movies of the times, in the comic strips, and the other all kinds of entertainment and popular mass media. So theatre has often been a stimulus for change or a challenge to a complacent culture, but the anti-communist hysteria did not let it grow much, because there was always there is a need for change, but there is also a belief that such sort of a change should not go overboard and become something which would affect the everyday life of people. So we find this fine balance operating in these plays in different ways. So maybe which is why from the 1940s onwards, in the post-war period, we find a lot of these playwrights experimenting with the theatre of ideas. So Arthur Miller, in that sense, is seen as the only new playwright who attempted the theatre of ideas, and he was also following the tradition of Ibsen, who was seen as very radical and who was seen as a source for a lot of potentially revolutionary ideas. And in Arthur Miller's play, we find him trying to confront the contemporary politics. We find it growing more and more in his 1950s plays. It is The Crucible and A View from the Bridge. It was milder and subtle and more subdued in his earlier plays like All My Sons and Death of a Salesman. But we find him dealing with very pressing issues such as the struggle between self-interest and self-sacrifice, with codes of honor, and in all of these, he's also trying to reflect the moral dilemma of the times, which was obviously there in All My Sons too, where wartime prosperity is pitched against the moral dilemma within a single family itself. So there is a move towards the psychological explorations thanks to the massive influence of Freud. We find that the American theatre experiments a bit with Freud, because even a book which is titled Freud on Broadway, it talks about how the Freudian theories provided an underpin for much of modern American drama, because it also explores at length the relationship between individuals within families, the struggle and the stress which emerges out of that. So maybe one of the things that this author also pointing out is that the fascination with Freudian psychology and psychotherapy in the post-war years might have pushed the theatre towards psychological explorations of the individual in any case, but the proscription against political theatre hastened the shift in emphasis. So instead of going political with the critique, the theatre of ideas also found it very convenient to focus on the psychological element, so that the political element will not overshadow anything, or will not hijack the discussion, because it was also not a quote-unquote safe territory to enter, because the capitalist ideals could always be threatened by an invasion of these multiple political ideologies such as communism. So this psychological theatre, the psychological exploration of the individual, it gains a lot of momentum also to avoid the move towards political theatre. So if you again recall the discussions that we've had in the context of the plays that we have already covered, American drama seems to be preoccupied with the individual's struggle. It's always the protagonist who's an individual. He's in this ongoing struggle against the society, finding it difficult to fit in for some reason or the other. And it's also played out in the microcosm of a domestic or a familial setting. This is something we notice throughout in almost all the plays. It also opens the play most of the times. The opening scene is in the living room, drawing attention to the kind of family that the protagonist is part of, and then the struggle which is played out within this micro setting, within this domestic familial setting. It could be a dysfunctional family, it could be an incomplete family, sometimes it could be a family which looks very happy together but quite odd and weird to comprehend. So, and this individual who is placed within particular familial settings, they have an ongoing struggle against the society as well. And there will be these movements back and forth, because you also find that various individuals have sometimes differing kinds of struggles in either trying to fit in or trying to break away, which we have seen in Glass Menagerie in different ways, in You Can't Take It With You. So regardless of the components of tragedy or comedy which are part of these plays, we find that this struggle is very real. This struggle becomes the center around which most of the discussions happen in these plays. So through the 50s, the most remarkable playwright of personal angst continued to be Tennessee Williams. We saw it in his earliest play, Emperor Jones. His characters were the outcasts of society, possessed by some internal demons, searching for human contact and understanding. The expressionist techniques used in Emperor Jones had very beautifully captured that as well. And while the locale and provenance of these characters were often exotic, frequently the Gothic sort, again, think about the images, the internal struggles that Emperor Jones is made to undergo in that play. The inner spirituality of the characters nonetheless appealed to the Broadway audiences of the time. But the playwright who best succeeded in melding poetic realism with gritty American naturalism was William Inge, and these are the plays that we may not be able to cover in the context of this course, but we will certainly be alluding to, we will certainly be referring to some of the works which were dramas about the private dilemmas of obscure people. So even in the plays that we have already done with, not just in William Inge's Come Back, Little Sheba, Picnic, Bus Stop, and The Dark at the Top of the Stairs, which were very prominent in the 50s. If you look at the other plays that we have covered as part of this course too, we would agree with Brooks Atkinson that this was about private dilemmas of obscure people. These are not like, it's not modeled along the lines of the Shakespearean kind of plays where it is a life of a well-known person. It's a fall of a hero. Here, these are people who've always led lives in obscurity, who were never known by even the closest people with whom they were working with. They were nameless bodies. Their identities were never important. And these are the stories, these are the stories which try to capture the dilemma and struggles and the psychological dilemmas that these characters go through. So if you look at Glass Menagerie, it is set in a decaying industrial city, St. Louis, and it is the city often in the play is seen through the fire escapes of an alley. And we will find that, that is where most of the time, most of the action of the play happens. And in the fireside, in the fire escape, we find that most of these characters, they also use that as a space for venting out their emotions, and it's a very symbolic presence right from the beginning of the play, where the fire escape also symbolizes this site of the industrial city, decaying industrial city, and this need for the characters to get away from it. So if you look at a play like Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, which is it is a classic play in this genre, and it is also set in Brooklyn, and we find that there's a real setting. Sometimes it's very timeless. Only the broad years, a year or time would be referred, but the specific city, the location where it is set will be very graphically described. So here in Death of a Salesman, which is set in Brooklyn, there's a literal dialectic between the pastoral environs of the house as seen as Willy Loman's memories and the intrusion of the high-rise apartment, symbolizing the faceless urban milieu, which is why, Willy Loman also in the play we find that very appropriately he becomes a symbol of the forgotten little man who's a victim of the materialism of the society as well as a victim of his own personal mistakes and agonies. So everything come down together very heavily on characters like Willy Loman. And there also we find that when the houses, the apartments, the streets are described, the human beings who occupy those are seen as very minuscule creatures over there, and they lose their identity. They also end up losing their identity in this faceless urban milieu. Now let's briefly look at the way language was changing in these decades, particularly in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So there is a if you could pay attention to this passage, which talks about the bad speech, which finds its reflection in American drama and what it symbolizes. It's very interesting to notice over here. The youthful image of disaffection was identified with a slurred and mumbling style of speech. It's not eloquent speech. There are no soliloquies of stellar eloquence. We find that most of the characters, they mumble their way through the play. There are staccato sentences, half-formed sentences, and sometimes they miscommunicate. Most of the times they miscommunicate as well. We see it very spectacularly clear in a zoo story. Yeah? And this, this approach, it said that it was first popularized by Marlon Brando. It became associated with the actor studio approach. We did, see briefly about the emergence of the actor studio approach in the previous class. So to speak badly was also to defy authority, because there was a distrust of authority. There was a distrust of all those markers which were seen as being respectful towards authority. So in these plays, we will find that language becomes a marker of subservience as well as defiance. So to speak badly was to defy authority, parents, teachers, etiquette arbiters. It also suggests a distrust of eloquence. Yeah? And maybe if you again go back to some of the instances in a zoo story, it will become all the more evident. Yeah. It also suggests a distrust of eloquence. Leaders on both sides of the World War II, after all, had been compelling, even mesmerizing orators, but monosyllabic inarticulateness was merely a surface manifestation of a decades-long dramatic development. Characters were losing control of language. Yeah? So the plays exhibited this in a very powerful way. Yeah? The characters, the playwrights, no longer have control over communication and language, but they are losing control over language. So language is, as a means of communication, evaporated, and characters were increasingly unable to express ideas effectively or to talk to each other in meaningful ways. Language becomes a barrier than a means of communication. Here we find some of the tenets of the absurd theatre getting resonated over here as well. So characters in these plays become trapped in semantics, in situations in which the language itself seemed more important than the ideas it conveyed, or the words took on a life independent of the objects they represented. Yeah. So keep you may revisit the zoo stories to see the implications of this. And if you again recall this instance from Lorraine Hansberry's play Raisin in the Sun, there what what Benita sees as new fashion, to make her hair look more like the other's hair, that's seen as an act of mutilation by her Nigerian friend. So the erosion of language as a means of communication that could be traced back to the avant-garde movements in Europe, and we find it's also an extension of the movement of Dadaism, and we find the American society in the 1950s and 60s responding to some of these European movements and artistic movements in their own ways, in their own distinct ways. The sense of language as a game reached a peak in the absurdist movement in the 50s, particularly in the plays of Ionesco and Samuel Beckett, whereas absurdism in Europe seemed a logical, almost inevitable response to the irrationality of war. The analogous elements that surfaced in American drama seemed more a response to a materialist society run amok. So we find the difference again over here, just like the crisis caused out of prosperity, just like the difficulties and dilemmas emerging out of abundance. Here we find that the absurdism in Europe and the irrational absurdist engagement with language in American drama, they were very different. Yeah, on the one hand, in Europe, where they were also maybe perhaps the worst hit in terms of in terms of their involvement in both the wars, we find that absurdism is a response to the irrationality of war. But on the other hand, in emerging American drama, in the drama of the 1950s and 60s, the absurdism is a response to a materialist society which has gone out of control. Yeah, it's the anarchy which emerges out of overt materialist ambitions and in some sense, the American dream itself. The American-style absurdism seemed to spring full-blown out of television advertisements and situation comedies, which had become new myth-making machines. So it is a different kind of industrialism and market condition which is getting played out in America in the 50s and 60s, and that is what is getting fed into the theatrical productions as well. So, as we mentioned, this breakdown of language was already implicit in Death of a Salesman and some of Williams' plays. It became explicit in the plays of Edward Albee. Albee burst onto the scene in 1960 with an off-Broadway production of 4 one-act plays: The Zoo Story, The Death of Bessie Smith, The Sandbox, and An American Dream. And the final two, were more in alignment with the French absurdists and their archetypal characters. And the first one we have definitely taken a look at in detail, the Zoo Story. And Albie's other play, which again, we have discussed as part of this course, the landmark Broadway production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. It's a devastating critique, as we have noticed, of the American family and by implication the American society. So here in most of the plays, again, we find that when the American individual or the American society is getting critiqued, by extension, it is also a critique of the nation, critique of the society. In a long, emotionally brutal night, the protagonists George and Martha verbally attack and destroy each other and their two guests while shattering the illusions that have allowed them to function for 2 decades. Also, we find language becoming something which can destroy. Language is not something which can only connect and communicate. It also has the power to completely destroy and annihilate what has been built over 2 decades. So in Zoo Story, we find the character of Jerry. He literally, commands the stage with an assault of language. Yeah, it's a language and approach which makes Peter as well as the audience uncomfortable at various points. Martha in Virginia Woolf, we find that she bursts upon the stage with a Bette Davis quote, which leads to a long night's journey of etymological gamesmanship and the revelation of a child who exists only as a verbal construct. So the power of language over here as something to destruct, as something which can unpack the existing situation is its possibilities are explored and experimented with in the drama of the 1950s and 60s. Yeah. So with this, we will bring this session to an end. And in the final segment of this discussion, we will take a look at how the theatre continued to grow outside of the New York City, even after the visible decline which was beginning to affect the Broadway theatre. I thank you for your time again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.